Shannon. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Megan Jacobs, and I'm the webinar coordinator here at Data Blueprint. We are so excited that you all found the time to join us for today's webinar on Show Me the Money, the Business Value of Data and ROI. As always, a big thank you goes out to Shannon, Kemp, and Dataversity for hosting us. We'll get started in just a few minutes after I introduce your speaker and also let you know about some housekeeping items. We're planning 1 hour for the presentation, followed by a 30-minute Q&A session. Due to the large number of participants, we have everyone on mute, but we will be collecting questions via the public chat. We will try to answer as many questions as time allows at the end, but feel free to submit them as they come up throughout the session. And to answer the top 2 of your most commonly asked questions, yes, you will receive an email with links to download today's materials and any other information you request during the session within the next 2 business days. You can find us on Twitter and Facebook. We have set up the hashtag DataEd on Twitter, so if you're logged on, feel free to use it in your tweets and submit your questions and comments that way. We'll keep an eye on the Twitter feed, and we'll include answers to those questions in the Q&A towards the end as well. We also wanted to let you know about a brand new LinkedIn group, Data Management and Business Intelligence. It's a great place to keep up with industry news, connect with other data management professionals, and gain access to educational resources. Now let me introduce you to our speaker. Dr. Peter Aiken is an internationally recognized thought leader in the data management field. Many of you already know him and have seen him at conferences nationally and worldwide. He has more than 30 years of experience and has received many awards for his outstanding contributions. He's also the founding director of Data Blueprint. Peter has written 7 books and dozens of articles. He has experience with more than 500 data management practices in 20 countries and consistently named as one of the top 10 data management experts in the world. Peter has spent multi-year immersions with organizations as diverse as the U.S. Department of Defense, Deutsche Bank, Nokia, Wells Fargo, the Commonwealth of Virginia, and Walmart. He is highly desired at conferences and workshops and always traveling to numerous speaking engagements and projects. Last week he was in Florida at the Data Governance Winter Conference. Peter, where are you today?
Actually, Megan, I am getting ready to hit the road as soon as I finish this, for I have one last stop to make before I can stop for the year. So hopefully everybody else's year is winding down, and everybody's getting ready for a nice holiday season in here. But we thought since the season evolves around money, and gosh, the election was about money and things like that, we'd talk about return on investment today. There is another ROI, that is the risk of incarceration, but that's a different topic. We'll come back to that one when we do the schedule for next year on this. As always, these are brought to you by Data Blueprint, and we are affiliated with the Virginia Commonwealth University School of Business. They own part of Data Blueprint, the company, and we're, of course, tremendously pleased with that affiliation as we go through it. Our outline today is we're going to look specifically at, again, where we always start, data management as an overview to place this in context. Then we're going to do a little exercise that I call root cause analysis. We'll look at some ineffective data management investment numbers, and they're kind of shocking. I'm hoping for some people that really kind of react strongly to this, and maybe we'll get into some discussions about it. But the numbers are really kind of astounding when you look overall at what's going on this. Then we'll go into some success stories, and this is really the meat of the presentation. Section 4, I'll give you a couple of specific examples where we've taken things that people don't normally consider to be sort of data management investments and show how we have monetized them, working with a number of different groups on these. And it's interesting, the last time I gave this presentation, the full version of it is about 3.5 hours. I was in Ohio, and somebody put their hands up and said, okay, who did all these things? And I should really say this is our team that does this. So these are Data Blueprint stories that we're going to be telling you about on this, and they're all real. And in fact, many of them are going to be documented in a book that I have coming out, hopefully the probably second quarter next year, looking at this. Anyway, we'll finish up as we always do with some guiding principles and some Q&A and takeaway as well on this. So as always, when we start these things, we always want to introduce you, if you haven't seen it already, to the DEMBOK wheel. And the wheel here describes the data management functions that we have. We'll kick over in January and do a revised version of this, but we've had a lot of people that have used these seminars to go through and become certified in those areas, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. The other part of it is, though, just to realize that it's not always about technical disciplines here. There's a lot of non-technical disciplines that go into this as well, and we want to make sure that we do this so that people don't see data management as strictly a technical discipline. On here, I mentioned the CDMP before. We're about 1,000 people worldwide that have managed to achieve the CDMP designation. We're hoping many, many more continue to do this. And if this seminar series has been helpful to you getting certified personally, we'd love to hear from you directly because, again, that's the only way we can make these seminars better is by getting feedback from you guys. So the CDMP is the Certified Data Management Professional designation. It's administered by DAMA International and the Institute for the Certification of Computing Professionals, a group we've had a long time affiliation with. It gives a distinct group of members that you become an alum of when you do this. As I said, there are less than 1,000 or about 1,000 worldwide all the way around. But it's recognition for your specialized knowledge in this area. It's a series of 3 exams. I've given you the links right there at the bottom of the page. You should be able to click on them and go directly to it in order to get these designations. But we're really starting to see some progress, not just here in the U.S. where we are seeing jobs that are coming out that are saying CDMP preferred, but we saw our first ones in Europe at the last conference in London that we were at too. So again, it's starting to spread worldwide. We're really pleased with it, and we'd love to hear from you if you're part of those success stories that go around this. So let's dive in. What do we mean by data management? We put up this terrific after-lunch chart that's horribly confusing and not really helpful, and then break it down into 5 specific areas. So this is an IDEF chart. Those of you that remember IDEF from many, many years ago in terms of how to do it, and you can actually follow it. It makes sense. But let's give you the management overview here. There are 5 functions in data management. The first one is to make sure that you manage your data coherently, that you want everybody singing literally off the same sheet of paper. What happens in most organizations is that you have a lot of professionals who are dedicated and working very, very hard, but they're not working towards common goals. In fact, sometimes we find out they're working towards goals that are at cross purposes with each other. So again, it's important to be on the same sheet of paper. The second component is to make sure that as you're sharing data across boundaries, whatever those boundaries happen to be, that you're doing it in the most efficient and effective fashion possible. Now, when I say sharing across boundaries, we have data that moves from one program to another program. We have data that goes from the marketing department to the personnel department, for example. And we also have data that goes between our organization and our partner organizations. All of this information is critical to be managed properly. We want to make sure that people put the right effort into it so that it is done as efficiently and effectively as possible, but we also want to make sure we do it within the confines of our security roles so that we're not having this other ROI that I talked about, the risk of incarceration. And if you happen to share HIPAA data incorrectly, that is one of the risks that is facing us as professionals in this area. The third data management function is to assign responsibilities for the data. If we don't have somebody personally in charge of it, then we will have everybody in charge, which really means nothing happens. And that's unfortunately the state it is in many of the organizations that we've surveyed looking out over the years at these things. Our fourth data management function is to engineer data delivery systems. That is the opportunity to really make sure that we have the most efficient and effective forms of delivering information to people. Sometimes that is delivered via database. That's the primary teachings from the colleges and universities. But at the same time, we also have the ability in here when we're doing data delivery systems to do portals, virtualization, XML, other things as well. So there are things beyond the college and university curriculum that we do need to look into, and it's important that you push your people who are building, who are doing the data development work, who are engineering data systems for you, to look at some of these alternatives because they are opportunities for doing things faster, better, and cheaper in these areas. And the fifth function overall is to maintain data availability. That is the idea that if we don't tune the databases, if we don't fine-tune the portals, if we don't monitor and correct and see how the data is being used, we have no ability to really meet the customer needs. So it's not just the ability to deliver the data to them, but deliver it to them in a timely fashion to make sure it's up to date, all the rest of the things that go in with it. So this is what we mean by the overall set of data management functions that we have here. Remember, you get all these slides, so don't worry about me jumping back and forth between them as we go through this. And why do we do this? Well, we have lots and lots of project fails that we look at here, and I've just put 2 screens of them up. There are just many, too many, in fact, to think about. But here's where it really does come down to it. When we look at challenges overall we see that we have a lot of organizations that are in the challenged or challenging area. That is, the projects have either failed or they are not delivering fully on price, functionality, or schedule dimensions in there. And so it turns out that 1 in 3 IT projects really does succeed. So the first question that you should be asking your organizations as they try to do these things is, what makes us think we're any better than average? Because if the average is 1 in 3 projects succeeding, I would really be taking the temperatures of some of the people who are attempting to move into these spaces and to do things in a very, what we call traditional fashion, pretending that everything is going to be just fine and dandy. And you'll see we'll swing back around to that at the end of the hour. In Data Blueprint, we also do a lot of surveys. And I should point out that if Megan mentioned at the top of the hour, if you have interest in any of these topics, deep dive into them, we can send you all kinds of papers, and they're on the website. You can just go out and download them directly. But this is one that we did where we looked at the health of data management in general. And the question was, what's going on in your organization here? And we were able to do this over a 25-year period. So we looked at 1981, and we had almost 45% of the data management organizations that were labeled successful. But when we brought that up to 2007, the number had decreased precipitously. Also, you can see there's a corresponding move towards partial success. Now, what we don't know, and this is a really interesting problem, is that are the unssuccessfuls, or the things that is the difference between the two graphs that I'm showing you here, the first two columns there, is that really just redefining success and people realizing that data management was much more broad. In the 1980s, 81 when we did this survey the first time, we were in a largely mainframe-based environment, and there was a single source of data and a single source of computing facilities. Now, of course, we have a lot broader environment. So it could be that this is redefining success, but on the other hand, we don't know. The other part that's still troubling is that when you look at the column on the right, the far part, it's a little bit obscured on your screen there, but it says does not exist and unsuccessful. The unsuccessfuls has gone very, very much up. Now, these are the perceptions of the people who are doing the work. So when a person in your organization says our data management program has been unsuccessful, that's not a very good sign. And you can see the number there has increased dramatically over the years. Again, the blue is in 1981. The green is in 2007 when we did this. Here's another indicator of that same sort of information. In brown on this chart in 1981, we asked the question, which came first, the database management or the data management program? Now, I hope you all agree that the proper way to do this is for a data management program to be established, to look over the organizational environment, and then and only then recommend technology based on the needs and the understandings of the organization. In 1981, 26% of the organizations followed that approach in that they formed their data management group first and then bought the technology. It turns out, though, that 68% of them bought the database first and moved in that direction. And the question is, what's happened over 25 years? And the answer is quite simply that things have, again, gotten worse. We're seeing now 75% of organizations are buying the technology first. And there, again, is some more that needs to be done here. We need more study. We need more funding for research in this area because we don't know, does this mean that they inherited the databases that they have and they had no opportunity to change them, or what? Again, there's just been not any funding here, and with the amount of funding we've spent on software engineering research, it's actually criminal that we haven't put as much effort into learning about these things. Here's another chart that's criminal. Very, very straightforward on this one. We asked the people that were surveyed, the data manager professionals, were they initiative leaders in green, or involved in yellow, or not involved in red? Now, the wisdom of splitting out your analytics groups from your data management groups is something that hasn't been proven, but it's a practice that a lot of people do. So in the data warehousing space, you might have a reason to say why we don't have the data management people, but how you can run an initiative called data quality and have no data management involved, or customer relationship management, or CDI, customer data integration, or ERP, master data management, without the data management people being involved, I'm sorry, that's shooting yourself in the foot, and I just do not understand it, but you can see it is happening out there. And the reason it's happening out there is because we are a new profession. If we date our official formation back to the World War I era, the British Secret Service actually invented some of the first data management techniques as a formal discipline. in this area. And by the way, the reason they were doing that was because they realized there were lots and lots of Germans living in Britain, and all of a sudden Britain found themselves at war with Germany. So they wanted to keep track of the Germans that were in Britain at the time. Anyway, move on to more modern history. In the 50s to the 70s, we kind of called this database design and operation. Then we expanded out a little bit further. In the 70s to the 90s, we got into what we call requirements analysis and modeling in these areas, and that was a big help, again, an expansion of our role. In the 90s to the 2000 era, we started putting organization-wide in front of it, realizing that these very large organizations, and even medium-sized organizations, could benefit from a concept we call data leverage. It's the idea of leveraging your data in the same way you would leverage your financial assets or your human assets in your organization. And finally, we've now gotten a whole bunch of things in since 2000 and plus, 15 years or so since we've been doing this, where we're talking now about data governance and security. And Shannon and I were both at the Data Governance Conference last week down in Fort Lauderdale. This is the 6th year that we've run these things, and each year the conferences get bigger and better, and we have a lot of fun, and we learn a bunch of new stuff as well. Just as an FYI, the call for papers for the Summer Data Governance Conference in San Diego, not an awful place to go, is out right now, and so if you've got a data governance story that you'd like to come and tell, we'd love to hear it. So we invite you to take a look at the Dataversity website, and there's a link out there that'll get you to the call for papers on that. One more little piece of statistics on here that we'll dive into before we sum up with all of this, and that is that when we asked professionals who have been doing this for a while, people who have done 4 or more of these integration projects, what their estimate of how long the next project was going to take and how much it was going to cost, these experienced professionals, the people who had done 4 of them, only misunderestimated these by a factor of 10. So we don't have good estimate techniques. We don't have good ideas. It's a very new discipline. That said, let's take a look at some of the things that we've learned from this. And as an overall, it's pretty astounding. Now, we're rolling up here on a polling question. Those of you that are new to this series, we ask you guys some questions on this as well, just to see. So our first one's coming up in the next slide, but right here, this just shows that we've got results from more than 500 of these organizations, and we are able to determine, in fact, that international organizations tend to be a little bit better at data management than domestic U.S. organizations, and that could be because they use a longer time planning horizon in Europe. I don't know. We haven't done that kind of research. We need to, and we need to find out. So let me ask you all, what percentage of data management investments do you think achieve tangible returns in this area? And we'll give you about 30 seconds on this just to sort of see where the sentiment is, and then we'll reveal the answer, of course. So Shannon, here we go. First polling question. Shannon, are you there? Megan, do you know where Shannon went?
No, I'm not sure.
Oh, sorry. It helps if I unmute myself.
There we go. I do that all the time, Shannon.
I unmuted my phone, but not the WebEx. So it looks like we've got people responding, and it's very close between A and B, 30% and 10%.
Okay, good.
Got a few people answering C.
30-second margin yet?
We are there.
Okay, so the answer in our estimate over here is actually quite shocking, although some of you seem to have gotten it as well. We see that about 1 in 10 data management initiatives achieves a positive return on investment, meaning they get more out of it than they put into it. And about 30% of data management initiatives return some tangible benefits at all, which means that 70% of them have very little or no tangible return when we're looking at these investments. Well, let's dive on a little bit, and thank you, Shannon, for that. Look at the root cause analysis. Those of you that are familiar with Ishikawa diagrams and things know that you can't just scrape the top of the weeds off because you've got to get to the root system at the bottom in order to find out what's really going on. So these Ishikawa diagrams are very helpful in this. Basically, it's a series of asking questions why a bunch of times. For example, one of the ones that we worked through was, why is infant mortality so high? And the answer is mothers are malnourished. And we say, why are mothers malnourished? And it turns out that they have substandard biology education in high school. And we say, well, why are the biology programs substandard? And it turns out that we had poor education of high school biology teachers. And if we say, well, why did that happen? We say the biology profession was unaware of the consequences. Now, this analysis right here, these 4 questions that I've put up, tells us that we are not going to have a quick fix for this problem. It's going to take literally generations in order to change the problem, which means that our approach has to be slow and measured as opposed to big bang and immediate in terms of the results. And when we look at the same question in the data management area, we say, why are so many technology experiences so poor? And the answer is they don't understand the role of data in IT. And the question, why is that the case? Well, there's little, if any, focus on enterprise-wide use of data in the educational system. And why is that? Sort of lack of recognition from the system. And why has the system not been aware of the deficiency? Because the people who are at the C-level, the leadership level of our organizations, aren't aware of this. They don't know what they don't know. And why don't they understand? Because there's little, if any, focus on on the enterprise-wide use of the education system overall. So a big challenge in that area. Let me give you an analogy to this that helps out an awful lot. In Detroit, when they put an engine together, one of the early criteria was, do they slow down the assembly line as they're putting these things on the car? So they're putting air conditioning and power brakes and generators and things on the engine because it's a good structurally intact piece of the car, and they want to attach things to it. Well, in Detroit, they considered the success measure did it slow down the assembly line, which means that you end up with 3 different bolts, which means in order to maintain the car, you need to have 3 different types of wrenches and then 3 different types of bolt inventories, and of course the number's not 3, is it? So Toyota goes one step further. They step back a little bit, and they say, not can we use the same bolt for all the assemblies, but they ask the question over and over again, how many fewer bolts can we get away with? And that leaves them with fewer bolts, fewer bolt inventories, and fewer wrenches in the process of doing that. Now, this is important because it means that management needs to do a little bit more thinking as they're doing their systems design. If they just slap more siloed systems into place, it doesn't help. The next piece of takeaway on this is that we've got to speak the language of our execs in the offices. So in this case, if I'm going to an executive and I'm talking to them about data usability, I'm not going to talk to them about how many data items I'm going to clean up. What I'm going to do is to say to them, if you give me the opportunity to make your data 10% better, 10% more usable, it's going to increase your sales per employee. And I say, oh, that's great, because the sales per employee turns out to be what the people in the corner office compare themselves on, or the return on equity, or the return on assets. So I've given you these 3 charts here so that you can turn them into it. And if you're in the credit industry, you can see that a 10% increase in intelligence and accessibility of data can result in a 28% return on assets. Well, that's a pretty good investment, and your C-level people understand that investment. Now with that, let's take it into some very specific stories, and I'll give you a brief little story here about our own Virginia Department of Transportation. At one point in time, we had these people filling out time and leave records, and they were redundant and lots of other information that went into there that was just not helpful. And so with this chart, we were able to show the number of employees who were spending at least 15 minutes per week working on data problems around the time and leave tracking. And we could chop it out by district. You can see Salem and Lynchburg are 2 that are showing in there. And we could also tag that to their pay grade. So once I have this information, I could put down and say, look, I've got at least 300 people in this organization who are spending 15 minutes a week messing with time and leave tracking data. And this chart I don't expect you to read, but it's the state of Virginia's entry-level salary for somebody who is at a grade 15 position, step 11. And we could go in there and calculate what the minimum amount of money being spent in these areas is, which means I can put together then a chart of this type that shows 73 employees doing this, 50 of them in accounting, and they're doing 1,000 documents or 20, 40 documents. Again, you can see the columns that run through, and the add up at the end of this is $150,000 on a semi-monthly basis, which means that overall this organization is spending somewhere just shy of $10 million annually doing things this way. Now that's money that's just flowing out the window. So if we take these numbers here, and the next time we go back to somebody and say, hey, we need some money to do this, I say, well, the times are tight. Nobody has any budget now. There is $10 million right there in untapped organizational productivity that an improved data management system can help them to achieve. And again, those numbers were very good. We were able to worked through them a number of different times, and they've held up quite well over years. I'm going to take you through a couple of stories that have to do with ERPs. And again, ERP, just think of packaged software, really, rather than necessarily the enterprise resource software on this. I'm going to pick on PeopleSoft on this one for just a little bit, just because these stories happen to come out of PeopleSoft, but they apply to any packages in there. So on time and within budget, 10% of them succeed on time, 35% are canceled outright, and the rest fall into the overrun category. And that overrun category ends up being an average of 178% cost overruns, 230% schedule overruns, and 41% of the actual planned functionality being delivered. This is not good. Anybody that's going into this should basically be going into it with a very big sign on their forehead that says implementing a ERP in this organization is going to make things worse for the next 6 years, after which they will start to get better. Now, again, the question comes back to you and say, why do we think we're any better than average? If I told you I was going to implement a package that wouldn't come online properly and achieve the enterprise integration goals for 6 years, would you have expectations that you might be able to do it faster, better, cheaper in another way? Now, it's a different sort of a topic. Let's dive into one of the examples that we're going to present here. First of all, this is a very standard, and again, there's an entire paper written on just this one example here. But there's a very straightforward example of payroll on the left-hand side in green and personnel system on the right-hand side in red. And the payroll system has 683 attributes. That's the bottom number of those numbers that I've put up there. And the personnel system has about 1,500 attributes, and we're going to put them into PeopleSoft so we understand the characteristics of the problem. Now, when you do something like this, if you look at the organizational planning documents around this, you will almost always see 2 months at the very end of the project set aside for something that I call the 3 T's. They give you 2 months for testing, they give you 2 months for training, and they give you 2 months for the transformation of the data. Let's take just that last one, the transformation of the data, and say, what does that really mean? Well, it's something I call extreme data engineering. If you take 2 person months, 40 person days, to map 2,000 attributes onto 15,000, and you divide the 2,000 by 40 person days, it gives you 50 attributes per person day. Divide that by 8 hours, gives you 6.25 attributes per hour. And then on the target side, it's 15,000 attributes divided by 40 person days. That gives you 375 attributes per person day, or 375 attributes per each 8 hours, gives you 46.875 attributes per hour. So you're telling me that according to the plan, your people are going to locate, identify, understand, map, document, transform, and QA at a rate of 1 attribute every minute. Well, we only do a couple things at a rate of 1 per minute. Breathing and blinking our eyes fall into that category, and analyzing data does not fall into that category. So when you take this set of calculations back to management, you just tell them you're willing to bet them $100 that they're not going to finish on time. Hell, I'd make it $1,000. Oh, come on, let's be Mitt Romney. $10,000, you're not going to make it, right? And you guys that are professionals out there know this. There's no way they can do it. But until you do the math and show them, right, they're not going to get it. Now, here's our second example within the ERP context in here. I've got 3 of them total on this. The first bit of trouble on this project, this is a different project now, was that this ERP was going to replace a custom-built software that had everything on one screen to integrate all this stuff across 23 separate screens. Well, you can see right away there's going to be some challenges because people don't easily integrate 23 screens worth of data in their heads. There's a lot of writing stuff down, copying back and forth, clipboarding, things like that. And management came up to the conclusion, said, this is going to be a big change. The other big change that we're doing in this environment is that PeopleSoft correctly uses person ID, person identifier, instead of social security number. Now, this was the first time that this particular change had been done in this environment. And so when we said, oh my goodness, you're going to change social security number to person ID, the boss, looking at 1 screen to 23 screens, said, can we postpone that change? And the consultant said, sure, it's not a very big change to go back and change all the instances of person ID back to social security number. Well, that's what they will almost always say when you ask them a question about that. But is that an actionable piece of work? And the answer is no, it's not. Not a very big change, doesn't give you any information to make a decision on. So our process was we reverse engineered PeopleSoft. We've reverse engineered the vast majority of the standard packages that are out there on this. And you can obtain a lot of good information from the system. We call this the system metadata that we pull out of it. And again, as I said, I could spend an hour describing to you that entire process. But one of the things that was important that came out of it was that we understood the workflow structure, which I'm showing you on this screen here right now. It starts off with a home page, then there are some business processes, and the link between the home page and the one is one-to-many. Then each business process decomposes further into a number of business process components, and each business process component breaks down into business process component steps. So you see that's a very direct hierarchical relationship. And more importantly, when I show you a screen like this, that is an example of a query that came out of this on here. It's administer base benefits being the business process in pink has 4 components. The yellow one is called manage benefit enrollments. The orange one is called manage benefit dependents. The teal one is manage leave accruals, and the pink one is report benefit participation. And Bibiana, if you're still out there, I know she's in Australia right now, but we're still using your slides. She's a wonderful former student of mine who's doing some really good work down under in there on this. Now, with all of this, this gives you the ability to come back and look at the number of instances that need to be changed. Okay, so these are PeopleSoft metadata that we're looking at here for the modules that we were looking at, and over here under the 1,421 panels or screens, and there are 7,000 fields associated with them, and there are almost 26,000 instances of a field appearing on a panel. When we have that information, I can then put it all together and come up with, again, another little chart like this that says 1,400 panels, 1,500 tables, 984 business process component steps, 15 minutes per, adds up to, in this case, almost $200,000. Now, when we forecast that out over the next 5 upgrades, as it is the law to do in some states, and some of the states are getting very good. Remember, you buy a package, when you make changes to it, you don't just make them the first time, you make them every time the package is changed thereof. So they forecast this with a lifetime of 5 packages. And now you say, is it worth $1 million to make that change back to Social Security number? And the answer clearly becomes, if it's a $5 million project, no, I don't want to spend 1/5 of my project making the system less useful than it was originally designed to be by PeopleSoft by using Social Security number everywhere that we should instead be using a generic person ID. We'll forget about the HIPAA requirements and the fact that it's against the law to use Social Security number as an identifier anyway. Again, hopefully this is useful for you here so that you can see very quickly. We can put some dollar values on this, and when we put dollar values on it, now management can make an informed decision. Again, remember where we started out. One screen goes to 23. Ooh, that's big. So how much would it cost to change all of the person IDs back to, in this case, Social Security numbers? And the answer is not a very big change. Well, you can't do that. That doesn't help. But if I say it's $1 million on a $5 million budget, I think people can make a pretty informed decision on that one very, very quickly. Here's our third example for packages. The challenge is that there were millions of NSNs, national stock numbers, or SKUs, stockkeeper numbers, as in items, right? Because this is a master data item sort of approach, that are maintained in a catalog, an electronic catalog, but that the data was actually stored in clear text or comment fields. So it was not structured in the sense that we'd like to have it be structured. If we were doing this in a more modern environment, we would call this big text analytics, right? But we're not going to worry about the labels for it right now. The key was that we were able to look at this and develop an improvable text extraction process to convert the non-tabular data into tabular data. And we saved this particular organization a minimum of $5 million, but I was most pleased because we all hear the term a person year, a person month, or a person week. This is the first time that my calculations had gotten us to a person century. Let's take a look at how we went through the process. And this is a little bit of a complex chart, so it's going to take a minute to build up here. I'll let it do this and then explain it. Remember, our text matching process went through and did some things. And just like any prototyping exercise, you have to manage expectations with this. So what you're seeing here are the weekly totals after a team of 2 software engineers went into this process and were trying to do some things that they could do. And you can see the number of items that were matched for the first 3 weeks were none, 0. we sucked, but we told the customer we would suck and that it would get better at a certain point in time. Now, again, it's important to manage your expectations, but by the 4th week, notice what had happened. We found a bug in the code that we had been working on, and we were able to match 55% of the items just like that. Now, 55% is enough to stop right there. We had more than made up for whatever investment that we were going to make in there. And now the question becomes, where do we determine diminishing returns? Diminishing returns, of course, being the point at which you get less out of it than you put into it. And if we're not getting anything out of it, we should stop doing it. So we move on now, and again, notice our numbers. We went from 0 to 55%. The number of items that we determined were ignorable went from 1% to almost 12%. And finally, the unmatched items stayed very constant right at about 30%, although you can see it dropped down to 21 and 20% and went back up there. So again, we're getting our feet wet, figuring out the technology, managing expectations, communicating correctly with everybody. Let me put the rest of the chart up here now so I can show you where we determined the diminishing returns to be. And that's pretty easy to do. When we look down and we say we've only got 9% that we can't match automatically, and we eventually got that to 7.4%, we know we're pretty close to a diminishing returns. The 22.6% of ignorable stayed constant over the last 4 weeks of the project, so we were pretty sure we had plateaued there, that 1/5 of the data that we were trying to migrate was actually obsolete or not real data in there. And here's the final part about it. We moved it from 68% actually to 69, almost 70% there. Now, let me draw your attention back over to the first column on there. Oh, I'm sorry, the whole thing there. It'll pop up in a second there. But on that column there, you'll notice it went from 9% down a little bit, and then it went back up again. So we had to go back in and ask the question, why was it going back up? Because that clearly indicated, in this case, a decrease in our effectiveness at doing this. So again, here's our number. At week 14, we had gotten down to 9% that was unmatched. But you'll notice at week 15 it went up a touch, and at week 16 it went up a touch more. And that indicated to us a problem. We either had more bad data that was coming in from the outside that was still being polluted. This is the source of the water pollution in the lake, to use Tom Redman's metaphor, or something else was happening in here. We had to find out, and when we did find out what it was, it turned out that, again, we had been given some bad metadata, so we had coded for that metadata and eventually fixed it so that we now had, instead of the original problem of 2 million NSNs, we now had less than 350,000 of them, 7.46% of the original problem. We could ignore 22% of the problem, and we could solve 70%. So when we add 70% and this 22%, that's 93% that we had taken care of in an automated fashion, which means we did need to bring in some people to do the rest of the work manually, but it was only a fraction of the original spot. Again, it's a proper blend, a proper application of person skills combined with the automation that we can achieve, in this case, in text analytics on there. So again, we go back to our numbers on this, and we take 2 million NSNs, and we take 5 minutes to review each of them. That gives us 10 million minutes that we need to account for, and we divide that up by resources. We took weeks per year, blah, 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 all the way down to the very bottom here, which is 92.6 person years. There's my person century. And, of course, the tricky part is I gave them 5 minutes to fix these. Those of you that are working professionals in this area know there's absolutely no way anybody can fix anything in 5 minutes in a programmatic sense. So let's just double it from 5 minutes to 10 minutes, and all of a sudden we're at $10 million in 2 person centuries, or 15 minutes, and we know that it's, again, going to be $15 million in 3 person centuries in order to do all of this. That's non-trivial in terms of doing this. And again, being able to save 3 person centuries is really good. I'll tell you, this was a government example, so we're really happy about the savings of taxpayer money in this particular case. Now, I know you can't read anything off of this particular screen. I don't intend for you to do so. This is an example of one of the profiling activities we did for one of the branches of the military. And it turned out that there were a number of things that were challenging in the military. One of the things is when you buy a tank, turrets, right, guns, all sorts of things like that, you get approximately 3 million data values for each new tank that you create. I'd hate to see what the numbers are for an airline, but I think that Peter Benson showed them one night. It's something like 17 million parts flying information is his analogy that he uses there. But anyway, as we're poking through the data and working on this, one of the things that this particular branch of the Armed Services said to us is that we think we're maintaining tanks that really should be obsolete, and not just tanks, but other equipment. Well, of those 3 million data values that were out there, only one of them controlled whether the tank was obsolete or not. So as an exercise in data governance, these guys hadn't done the work that they needed to do by keeping track of that one variable that says if this thing's obsolete, don't house it, don't have somebody start it up once a month and drive it around, don't grease the treads, don't fill it full of ammunition, don't fill it full of fuel. In fact, get rid of it so we're not storing it anywhere and hand it off to somebody else who, I don't know who else uses tanks, but I'm sure we sell them somewhere on the open market in there. And we do this by looking at the data, and that's the reason for putting this chart up, because it really does show you what types of analysis we had to do in order to determine the provenance, the lineage, if you will, that came down into the data sets that we were working with on here. And again, the number here you can see is $5 billion worth of equipment that didn't tie out between two certain systems. So this is the opportunity for the Department of Defense to save lots and lots of money on these activities. There's no reason to maintain an obsolete equipment. You get rid of it, and you put the soldiers and the resources that are doing that onto some higher and better uses. And since we're fighting two wars right at the moment, there are probably a lot of better uses that we could put into play there in order to take a look at this. So I've taken you through some examples, sort of millions on to billions, coming up with all of these things. And it's just a tremendous amount of time and effort that goes into doing this. Our acronym that we use for this, our TLA, our three-letter acronym, is ROT. It turns out that about 80% of organizational data falls into the category of redundant, obsolete, or trivial. So the question is, why would you spend any organizational resources maintaining it at all? Now, this next example, I'm going to actually get you to turn your speakers up here just a little bit, and I'm going to play you a little piece that came off of a very small investment. In fact, this investment was less than 250 British pounds that came into here. And this is how British Telecom decided that they were going to let everybody in the organization know they were changing direction. So hold with me, and hopefully you'll see this. Now, the music was cute, and you didn't really need that to get the picture out of it, but do you see what they did there? For 250 pounds, they got somebody who was very clever, worked with a package called Flash that many of you may remember. It's been around for a long time, just quick and easy, dirty animation on this. And they, in really a minute, told a story. Previously, information was stored across the place. It was a bit messy. Things were duplicated. They showed you an example of that. And so we're going to now sort our data into 7 piles, and these are the 7 sisters that British Telecom is now working towards to build on this. And when I was over there last month, one of my associates over there said, hey, yeah, we've got some new Flash animations that explain the process very, very well also. So I'm looking forward to getting them. But if this is useful for your organization, you are welcome to a copy of this. BT said that you guys could have a copy of that. It's just a little 3-megabyte file, so just send us a little link or something. We'll be glad to send it out to you. They're very happy to have their work acknowledged and reused worldwide at this point. We've probably sent out several thousand copies of the thing over the past couple of years on this. But what happened here was that when this went out, they could tell what employees had read it. They could tell how many times they'd viewed it. And when they did follow-up surveys, they were able to find out that people could name several of the 7 sisters. Again, a great way to tell a story about how they're going to change their environment, and a very little return on investment with a very, very big, very little investment, very big payoff on that return on investment. Now, that's a happy story. Here's unfortunately a sad story. Again, back to the military deaths. It's awful to have to even talk about these things, but unfortunately they're still happening. So the story here that's being told is that we have a group of special forces that are in the theater, and they're trying to blow up a Taliban position. And when they do that, they have to do some conversions. But then they rely on some technology, and they had to replace some batteries in the technology. And when they replaced the battery, the thing didn't remember the last position it was looking at. It instead reported the current position. So the individual who called in the strike didn't realize that by changing the batteries and then calling in the information that was on the GPS, he called in a 2,000-pound bomb in on his position. So 3 soldiers died on that. We've had an extraordinarily large number of friendly fire incidences. We want to keep these to a minimum. And anybody that would put this out there in the world where you're in live fire combat situation without a big warning that says, by the way, when you replace the batteries, you need to start the process over at the beginning, kids don't expect that with their iPods and their Nintendos these days. The batteries are sort of secondary to that process. So again, sometimes it's not all about money. Sometimes it's actually about lives being saved in this. And there's a bunch of other stories that I could tell you. We're doing some really interesting work in cancer analytics and BI and things like that, where the big data stuff is really coming to play and really making a lot of difference. But let me just sort of finish up this set of examples that I'm doing here with a bit of a messy story, and this gets into the legal stuff. So I need to describe to you the story here. Again, this is all, of course, made up from a series of cases, but you probably have seen something like this yourselves in doing this. So in April of the year, the company X requests a recommendation from the ERP vendor. In this case, it was PeopleSoft. And PeopleSoft responded back and said, Company Y is a preferred specialist. They're not only good at this, but they're really good at this particular module that you need to have in order to build this up. Well, in July, they contracted with the Company Y. Company X contracted with Company Y and said, implement the ERP and convert the legacy data. They started. They wanted to have it done completely by January 1st, so they didn't have to take 2 systems into the new year. Well, that's good. On January 9th, Company Y responded to the CFO, who was the project lead on this, that they hadn't been able to convert the data. Not a very good thing to do. They stammered, and they said, why? And they said, well, you've got bad data. Now, a bit of wisdom to take away with you. If you hire somebody to move your data and they move it and then they tell you your data was bad, you don't have much of a defense unless you've taken some samples of it in the first place. So not having had samples of this data in the first place made it a bit tough when they call upon us as legal experts to come in and help them out. When we do this, right, again, they missed the milestone. They said bad data. Eventually they removed the project team and they went into arbitration. Arbitration is always an interesting, fun process, but you might as well think of it as just like a courtroom. It really doesn't make a whole lot of difference, except that it's a whole lot more expensive than the courtroom because both sides are paying for all of the judicial system to do this. So I would never sign an arbitration contract if I were you on these things, because it's a much more expensive way of getting your results than it is to go the other way. So here's our expert report that we put together. Again, you do the standard process. Everybody does discovery. You go through and look at a bunch of reports, and you come back out and say, okay, so what have you got and what have we got? And you put that in front of the arbitration panel or the judge or whoever's in place. And our expert report provided some specific information that said the company-wise conversion code introduced errors into the data. Oops, that's a little problematic. Glad we found it. We were able to save our clients in this case. Some data that Company Y converted was of noticeably, measurably lower quality than the data before the conversion, that Company Y had caused harm by not performing an analysis of legacy systems, and that they'd also withheld specific information from the company on this. And again, I'm not going through the whole case here, but I'll give you the highlights in the last few minutes that we have here. First one is that PeopleSoft, as you might imagine, has some scripts for reading in new data into the system. Sounds great. You can see here I've highlighted it checks their code, checks to see if the applicant exists on the database using, we're back to Social Security number at this point. It's okay. Right? That's how they brought it in, and then transforms it into a person ID. Well, what these folks did was that when they ran it in there the first time, it didn't work the way they wanted it to. So they ran it a second time, and the code correctly said, hey, that person's already out there on the database, so I'm not going to add them, or in this case, this group of employees. I'll show you how big the group was. It was not a large group. And so what did these knuckleheads do? They went and commented out the code that says, check to see if this applicant already exists on the database. What does that do? Well, when I went in and did a query from it, it turned out that in this particular instance, there were only 6,000 customers, and they ended up with 63,000. And there were only 10,000 instances of employment on this. As a temp agency, in fact. And they came up with 100,000 of them. In other words, there was roughly 10 times the amount of data in the target system than there should have been. So that made it relatively easy for us to go through and describe what the problems were in this area. Again, I'm expecting 6,000 and I've got 63,000, and I'm expecting 10,000 and I've got 100,000. Okay. Now, you can also see, those of you that have been in the business for quite a bit, this is not a big conversion. This is a relatively small conversion as conversions go. And yet, interestingly, in this entire process, too, this is the actual project document that came out at the beginning of the project, where they recognized that the quality of the conversion date was a high risk. Now, when you identify a high risk, you should take steps to ameliorate that high risk. And if you follow the PMBOK, remember we talked about the DMBOK earlier, the PMBOK is the project management body of knowledge. And the PMBOK says that we need to develop risk responses. The response is you find something that is risky, you measure it, you check to see whether it's going to occur, and if you do, you take steps to head it off before it gets really bad. Now, here's the interesting part about this particular project. Again, the tasks and the resources you can see there added up to about 600 hours. Those are the first two boxes there. And in the project planning document, they said, company-wide, the go-live date may need to be extended due to certain critical path deliverables not being met. This extension will require additional tasks and resources, and the decision to go live or not go live should be made by November 3rd. Remember, they didn't tell the chief financial officer until January 9th, so that was pretty bad. And oh, by the way, if we do discover that this isn't going to work, we're going to allocate some additional tasks to it, and notice what we've got. The delay that would be reported in this case resulted in almost, again, 50% additional on this. In other words, about 3,200 hours, not 600 hours. I think that 32. It's about a five-fold increase. In other words, if we do it wrong, you pay us more money. And that's really not a bad contract from the contractor's perspective, but it's really not a good piece for everybody to put in place. So let's look at some principles that revolve around this. Again, what are the standards that go into this? Now, in most cases, when you do this sort of a project, you'll get this thing that says our work will be done according to industry best practices or standards. So when we put the individual who put that stuff in the contract, we said, what industry standards are you referring to? And the answer was, remember, this is all under oath. The answer was there's nothing codified or written, but it's the standards which are recognized by the firms in our industry. I understand what you told me a moment ago. The industry standards you're referring to are not written down. Is that correct? Oh, yes, that's my understanding. Well, have you made an effort to locate these standards and simply not been able to do so? And the answer was no, I wouldn't know where to begin to look. Now, if you go out on the web and just do a search for industry standards, you'll see a couple of organizations come up very, very quickly. The IEEE, ACM, ICCP, and DAMA, we've mentioned already in this particular piece, all have online standards, and their online standards are collected at a place called onlineethics.org. Here's a couple of standards from these standards bodies. IEEE, for example, says you need to be honest and realistic when doing claims and estimations, and that your opportunity to improve understanding of technology is really important. You shouldn't be misleading people because you speak technology and they don't. Or the ACM has one that says one way to avoid unintentional harms is to carefully consider potential impacts on all those impacted by decisions. Well, again, you can see there's a lot of things that go into this. And when they couldn't produce their own standards, we're now seeing judges and juries and arbitration panels who are saying, you know, if you're not going to produce standards that anybody can read, we're going to allow these people to infer our standards applying in your area. That's a very interesting development. It really represents a tremendous breakthrough in case work, and it means that you can get to a solution on this a lot faster. Here's the resolution of the instance we talk about in particular. It was a $5 million Canadian check in this case that went from the company Y to company X. Now we get to our second polling question here. We're almost at the top of the hour, but we want to talk about another topic just briefly. So which is not a reason why a data scientist might add business value to this? And we'll talk a little bit about data scientists here. So Shannon, mute off. What's our polling look like here?
The poll is open. So we've got, it looks like we've got a couple people answering here. Waking everyone back up. Looks like
talk,
we've got a few people.
You guys should know, too, by the way, Shannon is in Portland. I'm somewhere north of Richmond, and Megan is somewhere in Richmond. So we're very geographically dispersed this afternoon.
We're across the country.
That's right.
Yeah. It looks like we've got a lot of people. Oh, we've got a tie again between A and B, final seconds.
All right. We actually think it's B in this case, that the data scientist in this case doesn't necessarily work side by side with the argument, but this is one of the things that all organizations are going to be acquiring and trying to get more of. Even if you're not a big company, you're still going to need to have these skills and expertises. So one of the things we want data scientists to be able to do is to make this information more widely accessible. It means we can't speak to them in geek speak. We've got to speak to them in absolute English business terms that they will get. If I say English, instantiate your local language there wherever you need to. They're also going to be conducting problem-solving activities using these quantifiable data-driven approaches. This is not unlike a black belt in Six Sigma. I want the TQM on that particular one. But the third piece that they do is they do this data-to-business translator, so telling people what the data means as they go through the entire process. Now again, what we've done here in this particular instance is walk through a whole series of these exercises here, which is why is it important, giving you a $10 million example, a couple $1 million on an ERP project, a $5 billion for the U.S. Department of DoD, and there a $250 pound investment, relatively small, and then finally a $5 million Canadian investment. I put the currency exchange rate there on that particular one. So it's not that it's easy to determine the ROI on your projects, but it is possible to do so. And we've gotten quite good at doing that particular process, so if there's things we can do to help you out, we'd be glad to do it. We'd love to collect these stories and work on that. And with that, we're at the top of the hour, and it's your turn to ask us some questions. So I will turn it back over to Megan, and we'll see what sort of questions you guys have.
All right, great. Thank you, Peter. That was a great presentation. Now it's time for our Q&A. Time for you all to ask your questions. So just click on the Q&A chat feature. You should be able to submit your questions through that chat window. We've had a few come in here. So let me give it just a few seconds. All right, and I'll go ahead and get started. The first question is, your monetizing strategy is very helpful on a project-by-project basis. What work has been done on estimating the value of an organization's information as it might appear on the balance sheet?
Wow, that's a really great question. I actually had a good conversation with somebody from one of the top 10 banks who's working on that specific project. There has been work done on it. There is work going on in that area, but we are by no means towards a resolution. If you think about it, the question actually implies a lot of maturity. Because if you think, well, here's one of the questions that I ask organizations. Look around your organization and find out how many human resource professionals are employed to take care of, to promote, to make the best use of your human assets that you have in your organizations. For example, I've seen a company where they had 10,000 workers that were involved in the production of something, and they had 200 HR people that were keeping track of and making sure those 10,000 workers were on the job and helpful and productive and happy and supporting the company all the way around in there. Now, that's not, I'm saying, by any means the right number for your organization, but if you've got 200 people that are paying attention to the human assets in the organization and you have nobody taking care of the data assets, or perhaps one or two, you can see there might be an imbalance there. So that's sort of a macro approach to trying to determine what's the optimal level of making sure that your dollar resources are invested correctly in the data that you're trying to get. A fellow who's done some really good work on this is a guy I used to work for. He was the first CIO of the Department of Defense. His name is Paul Straussman. And you'll find some good work that he's done on the information, the value of information in there. So I don't have an answer for you, but I can tell you there's a couple people working on it, but not very many, because most people, again, aren't really aware that this is an area that's somewhat problematic. By the way, let me also introduce another book into this mix, too. It's a book by Douglas Hubbard called How to Measure Anything. And it's one of the books I read as I was trying to put together the information from this webinar, which you're seeing is going to be turned into another book in the second quarter, as I mentioned earlier. But it's a very, very good approach to trying to really quantify things that most people think are unquantifiable. So I don't have a good answer for you there, but I can tell you there's some work going on it. And more importantly, those of us that are in the data management community, if we collaborate together, we will come to these answers a lot more quickly. So if anybody has some resources, some ideas, some things that they'd like to contribute, please do get in touch with us. That's why I have my doctoral students. Because they can't get out of the program until they've made a substantive contribution. And, of course, that's the kind of contribution we want them to make. So not a great answer, but hopefully at least an honest answer there for a particular question, Megan.
Okay, and the next question is, where is MDM best located with designers, implementers, or operating people?
Ooh, I'm not sure what that question is asking. So when you say where is MDM, is that referring to the chart I had here, beginning, let's see where we go, right there. So you can see I have an MDM piece on there, and again, it looks like approximately half of the MDM initiatives have data people leading them, and about a quarter of them they're involved, and about a quarter they're not involved at all. I'm not sure if that's what the question was, or is it more of a where should it be housed? And I do have some thoughts on that as well, which I think are shared by a lot in our profession, that we really believe that this process of managing data is not an IT function, it's a business function. So we have an interesting challenge in that we have in our organization somebody who's labeled Chief Information Officer, but that this Chief Information Officer does not really manage or is not the ultimate authority on data pieces. In fact, they're usually, I don't want to say, they're just unknowledgeable because we haven't trained them to be knowledgeable. They know data is a problem. They're not sure exactly what to do with it. They don't have the engineering and the architecture discipline in order to bring that into play. So that's a big challenge that I see that we have overall. If that wasn't the question, go ahead and resubmit, and we'll try and clarify that. But I think that's what was being asked.
Okay, great. The next question is, where do you see bad data management starting normally? Is it usually within the design or implementation?
Well, yes. One of the other pieces that's very interesting, and this actually is going to be in very near future being released, but data is not part of the systems development lifecycle. And the reason for that is quite simple. The systems development lifecycle, requirements, design, code, test, maintenance, right? That's the typical systems development lifecycle. That lifecycle is created to create something where nothing exists. It's a system usually that they create. And most people think the systems are comprised of hardware, software, people, processes, and hardware, software, and data. Almost forgot data in that one. Anyway, data evolves. Data is not a creation activity. Data already exists in your organization. So trying to manage it with a systems development lifecycle is like trying to eat spaghetti with a big fat spoon. You can do SpaghettiOs that way, but you can't do real spaghetti with a spoon. You can do it with a spoon and a fork, do it with a knife and a spoon, but you can't do it with just a spoon. At least good spaghetti that way anyway. So it's the wrong tool for doing this. So what we really want to do is to take the illusion that we're going to create data as part of our systems development lifecycle and instead separate the two. The systems development lifecycle is for creation activities. The data development lifecycle is for evolving activities. And because those are two completely different activities, we have to manage them with two separate ways of doing the process. Again, I think that's the answer to the question that you asked. If it's not, please ask for a clarification there.
Okay, and we had another one come up. It says, my company develops DBMS for schools and nonprofits. How would you communicate this message from the private sector to the public sector, where the decision makers are very inexperienced with how data management could benefit them?
It's really up to us to help them to understand this, to make them realize that, first of all, they don't have a background in this, and that we do, and that there are specific scientific techniques that we can apply to what they are attempting to do. Again, wonderful opportunities and exercises that we can put them through. But don't think it's just confined to your sector. In fact, again, our measurements actually show that the federal government is ahead of most of the private sector here in the U.S. Part of that is because it's been against the law in the federal government to buy anything from an information technology perspective unless we can prove that it meets and complements our existing IT architectures. So there is a set of legal things in place. But that said, the real question comes back to how do we let people know this stuff is important and why. One of the things I like to do is to show them on a spreadsheet and show them using bad dates on a spreadsheet so that when you sort them by bad dates, right, then the bad dates sort incorrectly and your data ends up being incorrect. For example, take an educational institution example here. One of the systems that we bought at the university here recently had a fixed number of faculty that could teach any one particular course. Well, it turns out that that's the wrong answer. The answer should always be that we have multiple faculty that can teach a course. So the answer should be one to many. But the minute you put 14 on it, you're absolutely going to find the 15th person that's out there. And that becomes an exception, and that becomes a problem. And so, again, it's a challenge in terms of all of that. It's good to find examples in your environment that people have had trouble with. Show them that there's a root cause to this, but don't ever leave management with just the problem. Also go to them with the solution and say, look, here is a way of avoiding that particular solution. And again, we can dive into that and give you some very specific examples. So again, hopefully that's helpful to you. I know it's tough to say you got to find the examples in your environment, but you're the person who's closest in there to what's going on. On the other hand, my team loves to help, so just give us a shout. We'll be glad to work through an example with you too, if that's helpful for you.
Okay, great. The next question is, we have people in the company who feel that processes are the most important way of looking at things in the company and that data is merely a part of a process. How would you suggest selling data management to these people?
You know, it's interesting how these things go around and around and around sometimes. So when I was with the Department of Defense, I was with an organization called DISA, which is the Defense Information Systems Agency, and literally we had two halves of a bullpen where the cubes on the left-hand side were the data people and the cubes on the right-hand side were the process people. And if they ever wanted work to stop, what they'd do is either a process person would go to the data side or a data person would go to the process side, and they'd say, our processes are more important than your data, or our data is more important than your process. Of course, the real answer is that processes and data are symbiotic. Processes do not exist without data. There is no point in having a process if it doesn't have an input and an output, and the inputs and the outputs are data. So I wouldn't argue that one is more important than the other because that gets you into a never-ending argument, but if you say you can't have one without the other, that does sort of try to make them straightforward. And what I would do to really drive that point home is to draw them a little IPO diagram. That's an input, process, output diagram. And you can find lots of examples on Google. Just Google IPO and you'll see them out there. It's everything that's not an initial public offering, basically. And show them and say, look, your process is absolutely important, but our data is just as important. And see if you can agree that the two are co-equal. Because the minute you get into one's more important than the other and the other's not important and all, you end up with a silly argument that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So again, I would take that IPO diagram and draw them and say, look, here's your process and here's my data. Which one's more important? How about we just agree that they're both important? Because they really are. Actually, let me add a little bit on that, Megan, too. I don't know if this is related to the MDM question, but the real reason that most MDM things have not worked is because if you're doing MDM, you've got to have a really good understanding of your process architecture to implement it correctly. If you don't, you will provide the correct answer late or the right answer incorrectly at the wrong time. And that's really been one of the major failings of MDM as we've seen these.
All right, thanks for the questions, everyone. It looks like that's all the questions we have for today. Thank you, everyone, for participating in today's event. We hope you have enjoyed it. Thanks again for Dataversity and Shannon for hosting us. Once again, you will receive today's materials within the next 2 business days. And next month's webinar will focus on unlocking business value through data modeling and data architecture. Hopefully you'll be able to join us for that one as well. As always, feel free to contact us if you have any questions. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks, Shannon.